Welcome to Third Views on ADR Ever, a podcast about simplifying the traditional African method of settling disputes or the African method of settling disputes or the appropriate dispute resolution ADR in a bid to attract more users to settle their disputes or conflicts with mediation, ombuds, collaborative law, arbitration, restorative justice, early dispute resolution, negotiation, conciliation, and of course, early neutral evaluation. My name is DrChinweEgbunike, the host of Third Views on ADR Ever video podcast show, and I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Tony Guise to the Ever show. In different capacities, Tony has been at the heart of every major civil justice reform of the past 30 years. Notable successes include the formation of the Civil Justice Council in 1997, the campaign for new court accommodation in 2007 that became the Rose Building, and in 2013, cost budgeting. He now works full-time as the director of DisputeEfiling.com Limited, an online dispute management platform and campaigns for civil justice reform. Mr. Tony is also a visiting lecturer at the University of Middlesex, Dubai. His lectures concern civil justice reform and the intersection of ADR with legal technology. He wears many hats, so I've left the link to his profile. Welcome to the show, Mr. Tony.
Thank you. I think this is the second occasion that I've been invited to join you on the podcast, and I'm not sure if that's a first, but for me it's a second.
Thank you so very much for honoring the invitation the second time. It's such an honor having you once again. Thank you. So,
thank you.
Without further ado, the first question is, could you provide some insight into Jeremy Bentham's background and contributions to legal philosophy, particularly referencing his work on an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation? Thank you so very much.
Oh, of course, my pleasure. Well, by way of background, my friendship with Jeremy Bentham is now 45 years long. When I encountered his thinking in my jurisprudence course in the third year of my law degree in Bristol, and I was grabbed. My mind was grabbed by the way in which Bentham boils down the thinking to its bare essentials, and so sheds light. But to answer your question, born 1748 in London, died 1832, 84 years later in London. And to give sense context, the world he was born into, in 1748, Henry Fielding, who was better known perhaps as the author of The History of Tom Jones, founded the Bow Street Runners, a precursor to the Metropolitan Police Service, the first such police service in the United Kingdom. And Adam Smith was just beginning to give his lectures on economics in Edinburgh. And that's the world he was born into, a world dominated by the common law and equity, separated and increasingly ossified, rigid, unable to develop. And so that's what Bentham did. His father was very wealthy, and when his father died in 1792, Bentham Jr. became independently wealthy and was therefore able to devote himself to civil justice reform and societal reform. And the reason he did that is because he learned that the law was too rigid. It wasn't for him. And just to set the context for his thinking, because he is bursting, Bentham bursts with ideas. He was a child prodigy. So by 3, he was reading multi-volume history of England. By 4, studying Latin. And by 7, he was playing Handel's violin sonatas. And he was sent to Westminster School. From there, at the age of 12, he was sent up to Queen's College, Oxford, and where he read law and studied the commentaries of Blackstone, which he hated because of their rigidity. This is like And so when he came down, I think to Middle Temple, called to Middle Temple, I may have that wrong, he took one brief, one look at it, one appearance in court, and decided not for him. His father left him independently wealthy, and he turned to become a critic of the civil justice system, and one of the great reformers of the early 19th century. He died on the 6th of June 1832, the day before one of his great projects, the Reform Act 1832, received royal assent. A bit tragic, really, but at least, and if you want to understand, if anybody wants to understand the kind of society he was trying to change, you can do no better than to read the speech of the Duke of Wellington when he was Prime Minister, opposing an earlier form of the Reform Act 1832. Wellington was all for no reform. Very few people would have the right to vote, and restricting those things.
Yeah.
What else did he do? Well, he did many things. If you go on to the University College London website, there's pages upon pages devoted to Bentham. They hold his auto icon. Come on to that in a moment. And there is a page of neologisms, words that he invented. A very long list. It includes perhaps the best known of them are maximise, minimise, and international. And those are three of the many words that he invented. I don't think he invented as many as Shakespeare, but gives Shakespeare a run for his money.
Yeah.
He was active in all sorts of fields. So religious emancipation, don't forget that Catholicism was banned in England until the early 19th century. He was all in favour of emancipation. He was in favour of broadening out the vote to include women. Women's emancipation was something he advocated for, and he also, of course, became very involved in prison reform. And we can spend probably several podcasts talking about different things. Decriminalisation of homosexuality, for example, and since that didn't happen until 1967 or 68, I can't remember. You can see how far ahead of his time
he was.
Yeah. Very much so. And so we come to the point you want me to particularly reference, which is his early work, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, published 1789, which Bentham said the foundation for it, the underpinning idea, is utilitarianism, for which perhaps he's most well known, the greatest happiness of the greatest number.
Numbers,
now, he did not, in fact, invent the underlying theory. You can go back to see the, if you like to call it, as I think Popper called it, the happiness principle. You can take that back to.
You're cutting. I can't hear you.
So,
a little bit. I think it's from my own end. Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. No, it's gone now.
Seems I think.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, well then I'll continue with Aristippus. He said the guiding principle of people is happiness, and I won't go into detail in how he the practical research he undertook to explore the principle of happiness. You can look that up on the internet. But following Aristippus, many explored the idea of pain and pleasure as driving forces. In particular, David Hume in the 18th century. But where Bentham scored and became known for this was, as usual, he devised his own name for it, which was utilitarianism. And he said it's the balance is between pain and pleasure.
Pleasure.
So it is a problematic principle. It's a problematic principle, and we'll look at that in a macro way, and I want to look later on, as you asked me to do, in the context of ADR. But it is a moral theory of morals, but it can also be seen as an immoral theory. And this tension, in other words, it prioritizes the many against the few. The happiness of against you. So that's the heart of the problem. And people like J.S. Mill, you've mentioned there, one of his students, trying to work to accommodate that. And Mill said the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. So it's kind of free for all, so long as you're not causing suffering to others. And since then, Karl Popper has said, well, instead of talking about pain or pleasure, it would be better to speak about the minimization, a Bentham term, of suffering. So these are some of the issues that have plagued his theory, his great theory of utilitarianism. And one of the issues, which I want to come back to later, but we'll just touch on it now, was, as typical of Bentham, he expounds this and then says, well, how can we demonstrate? What is the greatest happiness? How can we determine that? And some have said, some commentators have said, and there are many commentators, it lives, the ideas of Bentham live with us still. Only last week, on Wednesday, I was sent an email by Elgar Publishing of yet another book recently published called Research Papers on Bentham. And very substantial work. So there's no end to the Bentham industry. His ideas live with us still. So Bentham was trying to prove how you can do this, and he developed a theorem, an algorithm, if you like, called
the calculus, hedonistic calculus, to determine.
He called it the philosophic calculus, felicity, and then a subsequent writer said it was the hedonistic calculus, going back to Aristotle. But does it actually work? And no one has yet been able to make it actually work. But what it does point out is that there is no point expounding the theory unless you can prove that it works. And so the question of empirical evidence for it actually establishing the happiness of the many is important. And just to round off the life of Bentham, he didn't marry, he had no children, and so no distractions once his father died from indulging the ultimate hedonistic activity, indulging in his ideas. Apparently he wrote 10,000 words a day. That was his aim, and or 10 to 20 manuscript sheets. And I don't know who was counting that. I doubt Bentham was. He was too busy writing. But what we do have is collected works of Bentham held at UCL and also at the British
Library.
Is there any evidence there that he wrote so much? Well, yes, because they're now creating a new collection, which started in 1968. It's not finished yet. Some 35 volumes have been published to date of his work. On his death, in his will, he left to his friend instructions that his body should be embalmed and then put on display. Whether to inspire others, I don't know, but that's why you see the glass case and the wood box before. An amusing story is that for a long time, Bentham's head, and this, of course, what you see is a wax covering around the skeleton of Bentham. But the head was embalmed and left at the feet of the auto icon, as Bentham called it. And it was at one point left on top of his box, the wooden box, and some undergraduates from King's College London kidnapped it, maybe familiar, in 1975, and took it back down the road to King's College London, where they demanded a ransom of £100 paid to the charity shelter. When that was not paid, they kept it. It's rumoured that they played football with it, but I think that's a myth. But what happened was that UCL paid £10. They returned the head, and it has been held in the vault at UCL ever since.
Yeah.
We should apply to the college dean, perhaps, to have a look at it, but it's not very attractive. So that's the heart of what Bentham was trying to do. He was trying to make the law more responsive to people, and that's what utilitarianism is all about.
Oh, thank you so very much. This is so interesting, and oh my God, I didn't want you to end. When you read about Bentham, you see that from his early days, he has been an inspiration, like what you just stated, like when he started learning Latin, he started invented the 3 words. And for someone like me that came from Nigeria, and the first thing when I went to UCL, that was the first thing that struck me and got me like thinking about Jeremy Bentham. And doing my PhD, I don't know how I got around it to put some of his thoughts on litigation in my thesis, and subsequently I taught law, society, and ethics in the University of Brighton. So since then, I've been thinking about how do we put all utilitarianism into ADR. It could work, can't it? And I think from what he said about the justice reform during his time in the parliament, and his books, you find out that what he was talking about, he didn't mention ADR, but you could see that he was looking for a swift justice system, which ADR offers. And when you look at the calculus, I'm thinking that most of the calculus is also talking about ADR, when you're measuring the pleasure that will arise from the action. When you look at empirical research done in ADR, you find out that the parties and the directors, mediators, ADR practitioners are all saying the same thing. They've used this and it's worked. So I think that's where the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people lies.
Well, let me pick up where you've just, that very point. Greatest happiness for the great number. And to touch on the calculus point, proving the empirical proof, because systems around the world, I mentioned to you before we started this podcast today, that this morning I've been virtually in Nicosia for the University of Nicosia's 4th annual symposium on civil justice, and they face very similar problems, backlog, trying to get ADR introduced, as is the case in Kenya, you well know, in Nigeria, your home country, and ADR is seen increasingly as a solution. And indeed, in my home country, England, Wales, your adopted country, if I can put it that way, we have been struggling for many, many years to do that. But as I've begun looking at this, and I've spent probably 30 years since Wolf's time trying to get ADR and effective IT into the civil courts, what I've begun to realise as you begin to introduce it is that it is not, you can see on a micro-justice, as I call it, micro-justice level, ADR is good because for all the reasons you just mentioned, it is flexible. People express, in the course of a mediation, people express themselves in their terms, not the terms of art that some legal terms have assumed, or Latin that most people these days do not understand. And the whole process is much more user-friendly. It can result in outcomes, non-binary outcomes, which the courts obviously cannot deliver. And earlier this week, I attended a lecture by Mr. Justice Gugi from the Kenyan High Court, and he was saying that the courts decide, they do not resolve, whereas in mediation you resolve problems. And I thought that was quite a nice way of putting it. But if you look at a micro level, all is well. But when you start to enter the era of mass resolution for ADR, the application, let's talk about mediation. The application of mediation to hundreds of thousands of cases every year in different jurisdictions, millions of cases perhaps. The question is, how is ADR inserted? How do you know you're not simply creating another backlog? Point that was made by Professor Sandra Kramer during the course of her talk in Nicosia this morning. And I think this is the area we have to look at. And so it is not enough, it seems to me, simply to introduce ADR. It is not enough simply to digitise, as we've done in England and Wales.
Yeah.
Try to. The digitisation of existing court proceedings. It is not enough to consult and talk. You have to do all three together. And it is this combination that may then lead to the backlog being reduced. So, for example, I know from dealing and working with the Lagos Multi-Door Courthouse Management Board, Achira Cole there now is the director, as you know, and I know that they have more work than they can handle. They have explained to me that they manage about 5 cases every working day with a backlog within the ADR system. They have the same problem in Italy. And largely this is because of the introduction. I'm going to dive into a little detail here, but we'll come zooming back out.
Well, Mr. Tony, you know why that is so? Because most jurisdictions are yet to give out money for ADR. The money they're spending in litigation or in courts, it's not as much as they do in ADR. You know, they're still seeing it as a second option. And remember that the court system, it's not only the backlog that's the problem with it, because there's so many plagues associated with the court system. You know, so.
Well, this is it. A point that was made, exactly the same point made in Nicosia. Civil justice is never a priority for governments all over the world. So to just dive into my point about it's how you insert ADR that can make a big difference. How? And so in Italy, after many troubles trying to persuade the legal community to support ADR, as you know, they've introduced compulsory ADR into certain claim types. But the way they've introduced it is by what I call the screening method. And they have required their judges to go through all the cases that are filed to see which are, in their opinion, susceptible of mediation. So instead of judging, the judges are screening. This has led to the backlog increasing, not reducing, exactly the opposite of what was intended. So this is my point. It is not simply a case of introducing ADR, not simply a case of using electoral. So their solution in Florence, in the courts in Florence, they have a pilot which involves artificial intelligence. And the AI they've developed has scans through cases and then comes up with, again, set criteria, which case is susceptible of mediation, likely to settle. I can't find how many cases have gone through that pilot yet, but in the cases that have gone through, 97% have actually settled when they went to mediation. So the AI seems to be working, but I don't see why you shouldn't make all cases subject to mediation, because the mediators I talk to, and perhaps they would say this, wouldn't they? But the mediators say, well, any case is susceptible of mediation. If you make, and my view now is that really you have to introduce mediation. It's maximise happiness, as it were. You have to introduce mediation mandatory into pre-court, manage it online, and that way you will then divert. If it's delivered by the private sector, you will divert away from court and make people happy to the extent of 75 to 80% of all cases that would otherwise issue. Now, just imagine the effect on the backlog of doing that, any backlog. And as I understand it, in Kenya, that's what they're thinking of doing.
Oh, thank you.
In England, in Wales too. So I think that's where the and so yes, so that I think would maximise from a micro point of view. You would maximise the individual happiness, because most people do not want to be in court. Most people view courts, as I view the dentist, with the deepest of profound horror, and they don't want to be there. They want to do a deal. They want to get on with their lives.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you so very much. I think we touched on the second question about his criticism, Bentham's criticism on the legal system in their era. And when you look at the present era, we've concluded that it's still the same problem, going on back then. It's still going on now. So I think we've touched on that. And so what I wanted to ask you, what I'm going to ask you, is about your thoughts on Bentham's influence on the law and regulation, while comparing his reforms with those proposed by those he mentored, like Stuart Mills that you mentioned.
John Stuart Mill, yeah. Well, I mean, I think since he founded his theory in the late 18th century, he has had an enormous influence in all sorts of fields. Obviously, initially it was intended for the law, for the common law to break up that rigidity. And of course, he wasn't the only one. There was Broome, Robert Morm, and indeed Lord Eldon, who was trying to introduce coherence to the practice of equity. But speaking particularly about Mill, he was concerned to try and reconcile the inherent contradiction that is in Bentham. And so he tried to, he recognised that if you make most people happy, there are going to be some people who are unhappy. And is that a problem? And so Bentham never really addressed that. And so Mill was trying to find a way of reconciling that. I read the passage from him previously in trying to reconcile that. He never really addressed that. And if you then take those ideas forward to today, you have that problem writ large again. Because if you say, the solution, as I suggested earlier, was a combination of consultation, ADR, and legal technology imposed pre-court. What happens if you don't have a smartphone? So,
exactly. I was also saying that in some jurisdictions, that would pose a problem. They're still developing, so.
What if one is, this applies as much to the developing world as to England and Wales? Right. What if you are illiterate? There are people in Wales and elsewhere who are illiterate. How do you? But so Bentham's thinking would say, well, he doesn't really speak about that. Well, he implicitly, because it's a bit uncomfortable. Well, it's just you're unhappy. Doesn't matter, because 85-90% of people are happy, if you like. But I'm pleased to say we have moved on from the early 19th century, and now we recognise we have to support the digitally detached. And there are methods which I'm pleased to say, certainly in Wales, HMCTS there, His Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, have introduced digital support to help people complete forms digitally, and that I believe is working well. So it's if you look at how people have tried to treat Bentham, beginning with Mill, it's all about trying to accommodate this inherent this problem that lies at the heart of Bentham's big idea.
Thank you so very much for providing that insight. Also, what do you think about the role of utilitarianism in ADR? I think you've mentioned it, but if you could sort of expand on it as well. Thank you.
Oh, utilitarianism in ADR, yes. Well, I think it's, I mean, what I would say about that is that you can say, again, it's this point about micro and macro. If you're going to go from where we are in England, Wales, mediation over the last 30 years since Wolfe has been a hobby, restricted in its practice to high-value commercial cases, by and large. And some people may disagree, but that's fine. But these are broad sweeps with very few practitioners, very few mediators actually doing that. Now, if you say, right, as they have said in England, Wales, this year we have mandatory mediation for probably about 100,000 cases a year for claims less than £10,000. So that's in place now. And if you say that's a good thing, the question is, how do you determine whether it's working or not? How do you determine whether it's working? So I'm really picking up, although it's you haven't got a problem if you're just doing 1 or 2 cases every week. If you're doing 100 or 200 cases a day, then you really need to understand who's not winning with this system, who's losing, in other words,